Thank you, Tracy, for the introduction. Thank you, Terry, for inviting me. And I always wanted to give thanks to my Mi'kmaq brothers and sisters for allowing me to speak in their territory. It's really nice to be here. And I wanted to start out with this little cartoon. I think it really captures a lot of our mentality that we have right now. And for those who might not be able to read it, we've got this ocean liner. Of course, it's the Titanic. You often hear some parallels. We can even think of James Lovelock's Gaia hypothesis, and the Earth is this kind of boat. The caption says, "Great news, Captain. You can inform the passengers that we have slowed down the rate of sinking." I think that's often the mentality that we have right now with a lot of our technologies in terms of trying to address some of our issues, and in particular, global warming. I'm here to kind of loosely talk about food and farming. It's going to probably delve into a lot more of a philosophical discussion around Wendell Berry. I'm going to draw a lot upon Wendell Berry in this discussion. But I wanted to draw attention to the idea that we do look at small-scale farming as a real answer to things like global warming, other issues around climate change, land sovereignty, food sovereignty, hunger, poverty. This was a report done back in 2008, and they took like 500 of the top scientists to kind of come out with this idea that small-scale agriculture is going to have a lot of great answers for the future of this planet. Of course, we didn't listen to that report. So they came out, and May Wen Ho, the late great May Wen Ho, she helped coordinate this paper, which is, it says, wake up before it's too late. Another call to the idea that we have to change the way we are producing our food, and that we need to address climate change, global warming, and that small-scale agriculture is the solution towards that. And that was done in 2013. Of course, I think she passed away 2014. There's other, Naomi Klein with, this changes everything. A real call on the fact that capitalism is the main culprit to a lot of our ills in society. This is a nice paper that is produced by Friends of the Earth out of the UK. Once again, saying the same thing. If we're trying to address issues like women's rights, indigenous rights, land sovereignty, food sovereignty, small-scale agriculture is the solution. And so, this is more of a kind of an NGO answer to it, perhaps. If you want to look at some more of the natural sciences, this is a paper that was put out by John Reginald, and John's from the Washington State University, very acclaimed researcher in the world of organic and alternative agriculture. This is a meta-analysis. It sort of looks at about over 400 research papers in organic agriculture to kind of do a comparison between organic and conventional. And as somebody who's in the organic world, it makes you really feel good. If I look more specifically at this meta-analysis, and in this meta-analysis, the main thing you're looking at is the size of the bubbles. If you look at a bubble that's, let's take, for example, this first one here, yield. And this is conventional, and this is organic. So you may have heard the idea that conventional agriculture is going to be higher yielding by a significant amount. But when you actually look at the bubbles, they're not too much. It is true, organic agriculture, especially when it comes to things like livestock production, are typically going to have lower yields. And in large part, those lower yields are a better balance between animal welfare and increasing yield. So you're often trying to optimize yield by also trying to take care of animal welfare in organic systems. But you can see that other indicators like soil quality, a significantly better quality of soil in organic systems relative to conventional systems. Biodiversity is also profitability, which is very important when we're talking about sustainability, that we look at the profitability. Organic agriculture is showing that it's far higher in profitability than it is in their conventional counterparts. And we look on things like, I think, that are very important to human health, reducing the worker exposure to harmful pesticides. Oftentimes, as consumers around organic products, we can often say, well, really, is there a real benefit in buying an organic banana? Because it's got a covering on it. Why should I worry about, getting pesticides on an organic banana? But it's really important to remember that when you're buying that organic banana, not that organic bananas are actually a good example because they're often cultivated on the same property as conventional, and they're often sprayed, and the same worker is working in both places. So this is a bad example. But in many other fruits, you are reducing the worker's exposure to a lot of these harmful pesticides. So maybe it's not really making a big difference in human health of yourself, but in terms of the workers, you can definitely reduce it through organic. Several other papers recently are coming out. That's the difference. We're looking at the wrong thing. If we just focus on yield, we're missing the point. We should be looking at the cost for that yield, right? Thanks, Michelle. And it's also really important to just kind of look at, minimizing pesticide residues, and definitely organic systems are far better. So, here, and probably a large part of this audience, we're kind of organically minded. We're probably trying to buy a bit of organic. So in many ways, I am preaching to the converted, and we can feel a little bit good that we've got some answers because of that. So unfortunately, to kind of make the point of this discussion, I still feel that organic farming, as it is right now, we are essentially just rearranging deck chairs on something like the Titanic. And that's why I'm going to draw upon some kind of work that really has influenced a lot of the way I kind of live my life and tend to espouse these beliefs. It comes from Wendell Berry's, I think, a seminal essay back in 1970 called Think Little. There are a lot of extensive quotes in the next part of this, and I will leave Tracy and Terry this presentation so you can go back to it. And I do have a few copies of another essay by Wendell Berry. The one thing, there's a quote in Think Little that I really love. It's kind of highlighting the idea that thinking little is a practice. We are in a society that bigness is so valued, right? And Wendell Berry in another essay talks so much about scale and the importance of trying to be at a human scale. And politicians don't like human scale. Financiers don't like human scale. They're always thinking big. And so in a society, we tend to value that. It's very difficult for us to be able to say, when is enough enough? What is my own personal human limits? What is the limit of my locality? What is the limit of my region? And so I think it is a discipline. We have to often take our great ideas and just put them back into scale, put them back into being able to make sure that we're thinking little. And so this is a little tangent. And this quote here goes, "As causes, they've been undertaken too much in ignorance. They have been too much simplified. They have been powered too much by impatience and guilt of conscience and short-term enthusiasm, and too little by an authentic social vision and long-term conviction and deliberation. For most people, those causes have remained almost entirely abstract. There has been too little personal involvement." So he's writing this in 1970. This is the women's rights movement. This is the start of the environmental movement. We've got the peace movements going on. It's the Vietnam War. I think he's speaking a lot to those movements. There's still the civil rights movement going on as well, right? So those are the type of movements that he's talking about, and they've been taken on with too little understanding. They've been taken on with too little commitment, personal commitment. This was written 50 years ago. how many of us can probably say, I think a lot of our ills right now are being taken on with too little personal commitment. Definitely too little social social vision and long-term conviction. You know, as a society, it's very rare for us to come together in a community and say, how are we going to address climate change in a community level? How are we going to address Indigenous rights in a community level? There's very little social vision around that. We leave it up to our governments to often deal with that, and forgetting that we are government. So, anyone familiar with the book Cradle to Cradle? Yeah, Bill McDonough and somebody, Baumgartner, wrote this book, and it's a very interesting book. It sort of goes at the kind of like a life cycle analysis of anything. So, you know, how much energy went into this plastic or cellulose cup, how much energy is going to be used to dispose of it, and so on. And it'll cover it the whole way. The book is actually written on plastic paper, which is kind of interesting. But there's one quote I love in that, is called, "Intention is the first step of design." And it's so important to keep this in your mind. I think it's a good way to quote to kind of keep at a daily level. Like, how am I going to shape my day? I'm going to design my day based on my intention. If I come in with an intention to be compassionate, if that's my intention, I should design my day so I can be compassionate. I should make room in my day so that I can actually listen to somebody who may want to come and talk to me about some troubles. If I don't design my day that way, I'm probably not going to be compassionate. I'm probably going to be able to say, okay, how do I get this person out the door? You know, and I think it's really important that we kind of look at some of the things that are happening in society and say, I wonder what the intention was behind that. And so when we think of something as potentially evil as Monsanto, you know, and if Monsanto is saying that, hey, we're trying to address world hunger and that we're trying to feed the world, let's look at their actual design of their products. Was that their actual intention? And arguably, if you are designing something in which you control all of the inputs, you control all of the financial capacity, I don't think that was necessarily your intention. So I think it's very important to kind of recognize that quote. So I'm going to read these out because they tend to be rather small. So I want to focus on the idea that right now, a lot of our intentions are often addressing symptoms, and that there's a real need in whatever we're doing, whatever fashionable cause, as Wendell Berry might say, that are being addressed, that we make sure that we're actually looking at some of the actual causes and not symptoms. So in this essay, which was written about 6 years ago, it's called The Future of Agriculture, and I do have a few copies here if people are interested. If, for example, we were somehow granted a limitless supply of cheap, clean energy, we would continue and even accelerate our destruction of the world by agricultural erosion, chemical poisoning, industrial war, industrial recreation, and various forms of development. Just giving you a little time to kind of think about that, and unfortunately, it's very true. I was just recently invited to attend a thinkers conference. It was the 60th anniversary of the Pugwash conference, and at that time they were talking about nuclear proliferation and how do we slow that down. This time we were talking about climate change, and it was very unfortunate that a lot of the thinking was focused on technological advancement. How can we create cheap, clean energy? How can we break our way from a dirty energy like coal or fossil fuels and move to things like wind and solar? So there was kind of this, that technology will save us. We don't actually have to change our behavior. We don't have to change our philosophy. We don't have to change our practices in any way but technology will save us. Most of our popular worries, climate change, fossil fuel addiction, pollution, poverty, hunger, and various forms of legitimated violence are symptoms. So now jumping back to 50 years ago and think little, Wendell Berry talks about a better possibility is that the movement to preserve the environment will be seen. I always find it hard to read Wendell Berry because he writes like he speaks, and you feel like you want to correct him. But this is a guy who's published 50 books. It's just he's an amazing writer, and like for me it's difficult. So I'm going to probably bastardize this, but I'll try to read it again. A better possibility is that the movement to preserve the environment will be seen to be, as I think it has to be, not a digression from the civil rights and peace movements, but the logical culmination of those movements. For I believe that the separation of these problems is artificial. They have the same cause, and that is the mentality of greed and exploitation. And so, and I was talking to Michelle just before a little bit about the Thinkers Conference, and at that time, 60 years ago, when they were talking about nuclear proliferation, they had scientists from all over the world, and of course, all 22 of them were men. So 60 years later, to solve those problems around things like climate change, well, we had 6 women. So you can never solve a problem on the level on which it was created. To have 16 men trying to solve the same problems that we created is probably not the right answer. I think it's really important that we kind of recognize that we do have to change our way of thinking. We have to change the way that we are seeing this world. We would be fools to believe we could solve any one of these problems: civil rights, war, environment, indigenous rights, women's rights, without solving the others. And so that's why I think I wanted to try tying this into organic farming. I want to make sure that we don't think that organic farming in of itself is going to have any of these answers. We need to look at it in a very holistic way. And so I just wanted to kind of focus on some of these actions, and so you can put these actions on whatever your passions might be. So whether that's organic farming, using these actions to try to see how I'm either contributing to this or how I'm actually acting in the way that these are recommendations. And once again, these are the actions that are proposed by Wendell Berry in his essay, The Future of Agriculture. We must not work or think on a heroic scale. And that's really, it's kind of hard for us, especially if you're in a marginalized area like organic farming. We often want to turn to heroes. In our little world of organic farming, we've got rock stars. We've got rock stars like Elliot Coleman, sort of the guru of organic farming. Jean-Martin Fortier, the market gardener. You may have heard of him, producing $100,000 off of an acre. These are our heroes, and it's very important to recognize that we can't look and think to that, because heroes do pass, and we need to make sure that this is a movement. And so it's great to have leaders who have these ideas, but we don't have to think at that scale. We can be thinking at a very... We don't have to worship them. We don't have to worship them. We can draw from them. Yeah. We can put them up on a pedestal, but we need to be able to tear them down and then be able to advance and put it into a very regionally specific way, a very locally specific way, and a very individual way. So I think it's very important, and it's difficult because we all want our 15 minutes of fame, and we do want to have that kind of heroic, and we all have egos, and then we have to kind of control that, and I think that's a very important aspect in looking at survival. We must abandon the delusion that technology can save us. Technology should be seen as something that can help us. And we should be questioning it. We should be using that. What is the intention behind the design of that technology? And we have to make sure, are those intentions true to where we wanted them to be? It's very easy to create technology. We are a very creative species. We can definitely create technologies to address a lot of our issues. But are we actually addressing a symptom, or are we addressing the true cause? So it's really important let's make sure that our technologies have limits, and that we're just not incorporating technology for the sake of incorporating technology. And I'm actually a proponent of genetic engineering, but I don't see any current uses of genetic engineering that I would think are appropriate. It's a powerful tool, and I think we should be looking at that. But currently, I'd love to be convinced that you think that this is a good use of genetic engineering, because I don't see it right now. But I think it's a great tool, and we should look at it. But at the same time, that idea that, we can just turn to wind energy, we can turn to solar energy, we can turn to hydrogen cars and so on, we have to question whether that's truly the intention of what we're trying to design in society. We must quit solving our problems by moving on. And I think, to me, and most personally, I think I'd like to relate this to our issue, Indigenous rights issues, and this whole idea of reconciliation. To me, even as farmers, the idea that we can have reconciliation especially here in Mi'kma'ki, that we can have reconciliation with a simple truth and reconciliation form, as opposed to actually being active participants in a treaty, I think you're not going to have any reconciliation until we address our treaty. And we need to address our treaty in a much more profound way, in a real way, in a way that is very different than switching from fossil fuel energy to wind power energy. There should be a real transformational change when we start addressing our treaty. So I think that's very important. And as organic farmers, we are on unceded Mi'kmaq land. We have to acknowledge that, and we have to look at how do we best come to some type of reconciliation around that. We must learn the sources and costs of our own economic lives, right? This kind of makes a lot of sense. But we're so shielded from our own economic lives. That's what's kind of interesting about something like Cradle to Cradle. Once you get that in your mind, that there's a true cost to everything, we start thinking about, well, why are PEI potatoes only $3.50 a pound, or $3.50 for 10 pounds? I think that's what it is probably. We don't tend to buy a lot of potatoes that aren't from the farmers market, so we don't really know prices well. But why can a PEI farmer sell their potatoes for, well, they get a far less than $3.50 a pound, or $3.50 for 10 pounds. But why is that? And of course that comes back to the fact that we subsidize the production of most of our food in Canada. We subsidize it in the sense that there are a whole bunch of externalities that neither I pay for as the consumer, nor the farmer pays for as the producer, right? So we have to start understanding what our true cost of our economic lives and the decisions that we make as consumers. I think we have to give up the notion that we are too good to clean up our messes, and that somebody else will do that for us. So it's kind of going back to the idea that we should understand the economic impact of our lives. Who is actually producing those tomatoes that I'm consuming? What type of devastation is migrant labor having in those other countries? I should be kind of thinking about, dealing with some of the plastic that I've been bringing into the world, and in my consumer behavior, and how does that, as organic farmers, how much plastic is being used at farmers markets? And I'm picking on organic farmers only because that's, at an individual level, here is people that, I would say are treading lightly upon the earth, taking care of the earth, and yet at the same time have to be the ones, unfortunately, to champion things like, hey, let's talk to that health inspector and that food safety inspector and say, it's okay for them to bring reusable tubs back into a farmer's market. I don't have to use plastic bags to sell them lettuce, right? So we have to be starting to question things like that. We have to be, we're not too good to not clean up our own messes. And for 50 years, if you've read any of Wendell Berry's, whether it's fiction, nonfiction, it really focuses a lot about locally adapted economies. And I think it's really important to recognize that means bringing community together. You can't create a locally adapted economy without bringing your community together and talking about how do we become, in Wendell Berry's terms, mutually beneficial. That idea that the candlestick maker, the baker, and they all work together. That's kind of the reality that we need to be able to create again. And I'm not trying to romanticize either rurality or romanticize an earlier period of our life. It's talking about how do we become more and more interdependent and recognize our interdependence not only as humans, but as humans and other species, as well as with the earth. And lastly, and probably most importantly, we must understand that these measures are radical. And this is, I think, the biggest challenge that we have. And this is why I think, Wendell Berry, I think in one of his most recent essays, said something like, I'm never on the side of winning. I'll never be on the side of the winners. And I think, he's 83 years old, and I'm sure he won't be on the winning side. And I think it's really important to recognize that even now, we're really not experiencing global warming. We don't see global warming as if impacting us. And so we're not really acting. And we won't act for a long time until it does become personal. And then we may realize that, which unfortunately, according to May Wen Ho and others, it's going to be too late. But we do need to kind of look at these measures as radical. And so we have to remind ourselves that tweaking our ways of living are not going to be, they are rearranging deck chairs. And so we have to look at very different ways of addressing some of our problems. And I am going to end on this quote from the late Bill Mollison, because I like to end with a bit of hope. I'm not, as my kids say, I'm not a very optimistic person. I have some faith in our species, but I'm really sure we're going to screw this up. But this type of stuff does give me hope in the fact that the problems, and we will, and especially here in the academy, we tend to make problems look incredibly complex because in large part it gives us jobs to do that. But the solutions are incredibly and embarrassingly simple. And more you see that with things like transition towns. You see that with a lot of the anarchy movements in Spain, in Greece, in Syria. You see that in a real localized economies. You see that with looking at communities that have created barter systems, communities that are creating opportunities to be caring for each other. So there are a lot of grassroots efforts that are trying to make this change. And my wife's in the audience here, and I always like to use this example as one that makes a real, kind of amazing grassroots change, and it talks a lot. Nova Scotia has one of the lowest breastfeeding rates in North America. Definitely, I think we're the second lowest in Canada, and our breastfeeding rates are about three months. And in a town of Tatamagouche, they were able to change that to over 15 months. And that didn't come from government support, it didn't come from public health, it didn't come from the pillars, it didn't come from money. It came from women and mothers coming together and saying, hey, let's support each other, right? And that was a great example. And so that's my kind of hopeful end